Welcome back to On the Road to UNCCD COP16. In today's episode, we'll talk about Science, Technology, and Innovation Day. We'll look at a critical pillar for addressing land degradation, biodiversity loss, and climate change, science-based solutions. Our guest, Baron Joseph Orr, Chief Scientist of the UNCCD, joins us to explore how cutting-edge research, data, and technology can drive impactful land restoration efforts worldwide. We'll discuss how the Science, Technology, and Innovation Day brings together global leaders, data providers such as NASA and the European Space Agency, and experts working on the ground to shape the future of sustainable land management. He will also help us understand how science not only informs policy, but is directly linked to action, helping us build resilient and healthy ecosystems. So without further ado, let's join the conversation and explore science's role in advancing practices that prevent, reduce, and reverse land degradation.
So my name is Baron Joseph Orr, and I'm the Chief Scientist for the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. And that's the Rio Convention that's focused on land, and particularly land degradation, which basically means the loss of productivity and complexity of our lands. Complexity is another term for biodiversity, essentially. So we have a situation where we are converting land, even though we have only 25% left of our lands that's even available for conversion. We continue to convert it. And on the other side, what we've already converted is at least 1 in 6 to 1 in 4 hectares are no longer useful for their original intended purpose. That's the loss of productivity. So that's land degradation. And COP16 is where all the countries of the world that have signed this treaty, this convention, are coming together to try and move the global policy agenda forward so we can address this issue. Addressing land degradation is not going to be possible if we don't scale up our science and also the data sets necessary to address the problems on land. So the COP presidency, which is Saudi Arabia, has dedicated 1 full day to science, technology, and innovation. These are all linked together. The highlight or the pinnacle event for that day, which will take place in, I think, what they're calling the Action Dome, is a high-level interactive dialogue on healing our land through science and earth intelligence. And the idea is to bring together some of the key organizations that are actually producing this science that's related to land, to talk about where they are and where that is going, but also bring in the data providers. So the NASAs and the European Space Agency, the Food and Agriculture Organization, these entities that are collecting data about land, they're also going to be talking about where that needs to go to scale up the response that we have from the scientific community. And we'll also have in that interactive dialogue recipients. So these are entities that make use of those data to try and implement projects on the ground. So that's the pinnacle event. And then surrounding that will be a lot of activity. You probably are aware that the blue zone is where all the negotiations take place, but there's also a green zone, which is wide open to the public, which we expect to have a very large attendance. And the COP presidency has a science pavilion planned for there with a lot going on throughout the entire COP. So there will be science related to each thematic day presented in that space, but of course, some really focused on actually the Science, Technology, and Innovation Day. So a science-based approach is necessary because we need evidence to guide our actions. And it's quite difficult in the case of land because it's so varied around the world, right? The specific details of what's going on with degradation in one location or one country and another is very, very different. So the science-based approach is really important. It's on the implementation side, but it's also necessary to support policy development. And that's a key here. It's not only how we approach the science, but how do we interface science and policy? And that's a big focus of this Conference of the Parties. In fact, the UNCCD has a small body of a science policy interface that has been addressing bottlenecks, barriers to achieving the success in land degradation neutrality that I mentioned earlier, or in building drought resilience. So at COP, you will see in all of the sessions scientists trying to communicate in a way that's a lot more accessible to policymakers and vice versa. Why is it so difficult? Well, they're very different cultures. The science culture is oriented around the work of science, which tends to be where we're looking for a number, an answer, and an error bar, right? The level of uncertainty we have with that. That information by itself does not lead a policymaker to make a decision. Scientists also are trying to get at causation. We call it frequentist approach, right? So you've heard of correlations between this trend and that trend, whatever they may be. So what is driving land degradation? What are those trends? And those data sets come together. We may have the answers scientifically, but there's still a big gap of what to do about it on the policy side. So one reason there is the policymaker actually has to synthesize a lot of information, not only what's coming from scientists, but what's coming from constituents, what's coming from the economic side of it, et cetera. So everything that we can do to bridge that gap is key. And that space of the Conference of the Parties, where scientists are there as well as policymakers, facilitates that. So on Science, Technology, and Innovation Day, all the presentations that you see, or at least we hope most of them, will be just a little bit less scientific and a little bit more oriented towards how that science can be used. So historically, it's kind of gone step by step. In the early days of the convention, science was a limiting factor. That's not the case anymore. The science is there, and now it's about getting it put to use. Data was also a limiting factor. Less so now, but I'll return to that one in a moment. Then, of course, we have political will, and that has always been discussed in the past. But I think it's really heartening to know that countries have really stepped up. The level of commitments made at the highest level, right, heads of state level in many, many countries in the world, is quite high. Actually, the ones that are fully on the books amount to 1 billion hectares globally, which is, turns out, exactly what's needed. If we stopped land conversion today, it would be what we would need to return to productivity to get us back to where we were in 2015. So it's a very important number to be pursued. Problem, of course, is we continue to degrade and we continue to convert land. So maybe that ambition needs to be scaled up, but it's not our weakest point. The next one then comes, how do you turn those ambitions into action? And that's a combination of money, financing, as well as projects themselves. So organizing the right people in the countries to take action on the ground. It's not simple to do these kinds of projects. Even there, I think we're moving in the right direction, although there's a lot of work to be done. And you will hear that on Finance Day at the COP, just how much more we have to do to build finance. But if we then take it one more step, what's holding up some of that investment? It comes back to data. When I mentioned that land is highly varied, it means that we have to have data sets at very high resolution everywhere in the world at the fingertips of those that are making these financial decisions, so they know what is the return on investment. They know it in general is high, but that doesn't mean they know what it is for each location. So we have that little bit of a cycle going on there, but we're moving in the right direction. And then the last part of it has to do with resilience. Resilience itself is kind of simple to explain. How well can we bounce back from whatever disturbance, whatever crisis it is that we may face? So it's simple to say that, right? But to actually measure it is a whole other story. And we tend to do that through proxies. Again, it's a data challenge. In addition, we have to do that in a way that has foresight. In other words, traditionally, we think about land degradation as now, what the status is now. But we have to imagine tomorrow, what will be the status of this land in conditions of climate change, where rising temperatures mean different plants grow, etc. Very, very different situation. And that's particularly critical for food, right? Because what traditionally grew in one country that is the staple crop for that country may not be economically viable in 2050 or sometime in the future. We have to plan way ahead. That means all of our projects not only have to consider today's degradation, tomorrow's risks of degradation, but also the trends that climate change is pushing upon the world. So we know that the core business of a conference of the parties is negotiations among those parties. It's a consensus building approach. It's not easy, but there's no other alternative. It is the only way that we're going to get countries all working together. But the way I think of it is, if we surround that with stakeholders that have very good knowledge, in some cases it's civil society organizations that are working inside these countries addressing these problems. It may be other parts of the government that are not part of the negotiations. It's the big players in finance, et cetera, et cetera. The private sector is a big player there. They're all going to be discussing common themes at COP, and they're going to be hopefully making announcements. They're going to be those that increase the actual movement from ambition to action. So the green zone is critical because it's open to everyone. So it's the bridge between all of this negotiations, all of these big announcements, and the rest of the world. And so that communication is vital because it's not alone. We can't solve this simply by governments taking steps. The all of society approach is necessary. And the green zone is where we can make sure that that crystallizes. I think to close it is to say that we all feel in the Secretariat, I mean, we're basically those that are facilitating these countries to work together to solve these problems. And we all sense in the UNCCD Secretariat that this could be a turning point, that there is a lot more energy and discussion about land. There's far greater recognition that land is the integrator and accelerator of all of these objectives. And that if we could get it right, get it in balance, everything else can be brought back into balance. So that's my closing statement, that I think we have an opportunity here, and I hope we all grab it at COP16.